Here's a question nobody asks. When Mary Queen of Scots walked into the Great Hall at Fotheringhay Castle on the morning of February 8, 1587, knowing full well she was about to have her head removed, why did she choose to wear red? Think about that for a second. She had spent the previous night writing letters. She had prayed. She had distributed her belongings to her servants. She had thought in careful detail about what was coming, and she chose red, not somber black. Not the white of innocence. Red, the color of martyrs, the color of Catholic sacrifice, the color that would scream across every pamphlet and broadsheet in Catholic Europe for the next decade. Look what the Protestant English queen did to one of ours. The executioner stripped her of her black outer gown, standard procedure, and underneath it she blazed scarlet. Her bodice, her petticoats, her stockings, all red. She had dressed that morning like a statement. Like a last argument she knew no one could interrupt. That choice was not an accident. It was not sentiment. It was a message, sewn into lining, dyed into wool, carried on her body into a room full of witnesses who would carry what they saw straight to the courts of France, Spain, and Rome. She couldn't send another letter. She couldn't make a speech they'd actually print, but she could dress herself in a color that would do the work after she was gone. And here's the thing, that was not unusual. That was just what medieval and early modern royals did, constantly, invisibly, in ways we have almost entirely forgotten. We talk about spycraft and we think of invisible ink. We talk about propaganda and we think of printed pamphlets. We talk about political signaling and we think of coded speech. But for roughly 500 years, from the high medieval period through the early modern era, the most reliable, most deniable, most devastatingly effective communication network in Europe was threaded through the clothing on people's bodies. Colors, badges, embroidered mottos, specific cuts, hidden pockets, deliberate gifts, tokens, favors, the order in which you put things on, what you wore to mass, what you wore to a negotiation. What you sent as a wedding gift and what you chose very pointedly not to send. Clothing was not fashion, not really. Not in the way we understand fashion as a personal expression, a trend cycle, a preference. Medieval clothing was a language, a complete, functional, politically dangerous language that every literate person at court could read fluently, and that historians have spent 2 centuries gradually, painstakingly decoding. This is that story. It involves queens who stitched coded resistance into their needlework, kings who used fabric gifts as diplomatic weapons, spies who smuggled treasonous letters inside hat brims, priests who wore their forbidden faith underneath their secular clothes and died for it, condemned prisoners who dressed for execution like they were composing manifestos, lovers who sent gloves when they meant to say, "I am watching you, and so are my people." It involves specific threads, specific colors, specific dates, because the history is only as good as the detail, and the detail here is extraordinary. So, let's start at the beginning, not the romantic beginning, the real beginning. And if you're the kind of person who thinks history is more interesting when people are actively trying to get away with something, which genuinely it always is, then hit subscribe. We do this every week and we're just getting started. The language your eyes already spoke why clothing was political before political was a word "let's deal with something first before we get into the good stuff." When we say medieval royals hid messages in their clothing, we don't mean exclusively that they tucked notes inside hems, though they absolutely did that, and we'll get to it. We mean something broader and arguably more interesting. We mean that medieval clothing was itself a message. The hiding was almost beside the point. The real story is that fabric, color, and cut operated as a completely fluent political language that every court-educated person in Europe could read on sight, and that this language was used aggressively, deliberately, and with enormous sophistication to communicate things that could not be said aloud. To understand why, you need to understand one crucial fact about medieval and early modern Europe that we have almost completely lost. Most people couldn't read. We mean that literally, but we also mean it in the deeper sense. Reading was not the primary cognitive skill of the medieval world the way it is now. The primary skill, the one drilled into you from childhood, the one that determined whether you could survive at court, in the market, in a foreign city, was visual interpretation. The ability to read people, to read environments, to decode what you saw immediately and accurately, because your social and sometimes physical survival depended on it. Heraldry, the system of coats of arms, colors, and symbols, existed precisely because it needed to be readable at distance, at speed, through chaos. On a battlefield in the 13th century, you needed to know in the half-second before you swung a sword whether the man on the horse ahead of you was on your side. His face was hidden, his voice was drowned in noise, but his colors were visible, his badge was visible. His livery was visible. You read it or you died. That same skill, that same automatic, fast visual reading applied everywhere else. At court, you walked into a throne room and you immediately, subconsciously decoded everyone in it, who was wearing the king's livery, who was wearing colors associated with a rival faction, who had appeared in the same colors as a foreign ambassador 3 days running, who was pointedly not wearing the expected mourning dress. This wasn't aesthetic appreciation. This was intelligence work conducted constantly by everyone with everyone else's clothes as the data, and royals knew this. They understood it intimately, far better than we give them credit for because they had been taught it formally. The etiquette manuals of the medieval and early modern period spend enormous time on dress, not on looking nice, on what specific choices communicated and to whom. The Duke of Burgundy's court in the 15th century produced some of the most elaborate dress codes in European history, and the regulations weren't about vanity. They were about maintaining a visible hierarchy that everyone in the room could read instantly and correctly. Rank, allegiance, status, relationship to the Duke, all of it communicated at a glance through fabric. So when we say medieval royals used clothing to send messages, we're talking about people who were already operating in a world where clothing was communication. The secret was not the existence of the language. The secret was knowing exactly what to say in it, and when. The rules everyone knew. The foundational grammar of this language was color. Medieval Europeans did not experience color the way we do. We live in a world of infinite chromatic reproduction. Your phone can display millions of colors. Your clothing can be dyed any shade you want for almost no money. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where color was expensive, meaningful, and controlled. Producing consistent, vibrant color in textile was a technical nightmare for most of the medieval period. Most dyes were plant or insect-based, faded quickly, and produced muddy, inconsistent results. Getting a reliable, saturated red, a real red, not a brownish pink, required kermes, a dye extracted from a specific Mediterranean insect at significant cost. Getting blue of any quality required woad, or better still, indigo imported from Asia at prices that made it literally worth its weight in silver. Getting purple, real purple, Tyrian purple, the purple you'd seen on Roman mosaics, required harvesting the mucus glands of thousands upon thousands of murex sea snails. which is as labor-intensive as it sounds, and which had made purple the most expensive color in the ancient world for 1,000 years. The consequence of this was that color was rationed, not just socially, but legally. Sumptuary laws legislation specifically designed to control who could wear what appeared across medieval Europe from at least the 13th century onward, and became increasingly detailed and punitive through the 15th and 16th. England's sumptuary laws were particularly elaborate. Edward III issued sumptuary legislation in 1337, Edward IV in 1463. Henry VIII issued a breathtaking series of proclamations in 1510, 1515, 1533, and 1554, and the restrictions were specific to the point of being microscopic. Purple silk, only the royal family. Cloth of gold, only royals and the highest nobles. Crimson silk, only lords and above. Silk of certain weaves, only specific ranks. Furs, ranked by type with ermine reserved for royalty, sable for high nobility, and so on down the food chain. Velvet, only knights and above. The lengths to which the laws went were extraordinary, specifying not just fabric and color, but how much of a given material could appear in a single garment, how wide collars could be, what could be embroidered on what. The point of these laws was not primarily moral, though they were often framed in moral language about avoiding excess and waste. The point was legibility. The laws ensured that when you looked at a person, you could read their rank off their body. This was a society that ran on hierarchy, and the hierarchy needed to be visible, constantly and reliably to function. Which means, and here's the thing, that violations of these laws were themselves messages. When a merchant wore crimson silk forbidden to his rank, he was not just committing a technical offense. He was making a statement. He was saying, I have money enough to buy this and connections enough to risk wearing it, and you should calibrate your response to me accordingly. When a noblewoman appeared at court in colors associated with a rival faction, she was not making a fashion choice. She was taking a position. And when a queen who was under house arrest, Mary Queen of Scots, say, spending 18 years imprisoned in a series of English castles, chose to spend her captivity embroidering, of all things, she was not simply passing time. She was doing the only political work available to her. She was using the one language no one could take away. The grammar beneath the grammar beyond color, there was badge and livery, a second layer of the visual language that operated at a different register. Livery was the practice of distributing matching clothing to servants, retainers, and supporters. When a great lord dressed his household in his colors, he was doing two things simultaneously, marking his own power, look how many people I can clothe, and creating a mobile, walking advertisement for his faction that showed up everywhere those servants went. The badge, a specific symbol worn on clothing, usually embroidered on the chest or arm, was even more charged. Badges were not decorative, they were declarations. The white rose of York, the red rose of Lancaster, the white boar of Richard III, the Tudor rose that tried to paper over the whole bloody mess by combining both, the white heart of Richard II, which he distributed to loyal supporters and which effectively created a walking network of identifiable loyalists everywhere they went. Distributing badges was a kind of political statement. I have followers, I have a network, these people are mine. Wearing one was an even stronger statement. I am that person's person. I have chosen a side. And removing a badge or refusing one, that was a message too, pointed, unmistakable. There are documented cases of exactly this kind of silent communication. In 1397, when Richard II began distributing his White Hart livery badges on an unprecedented scale, giving them not just to household knights, but to esquires, yeomen, and common soldiers, 20 to 30,000 badges at one tournament alone. Contemporaries understood this as something alarming. He was trying to create a personal army of visually identifiable loyalists that would bypass the traditional feudal hierarchy. His opponents read the message. They responded. 4 years later, he was deposed and dead. The badge had started a political argument. The political argument ended with a king in a dungeon. Clothing as diplomatic document now moved the scale up. Not just individuals communicating, but states. Gift-giving between medieval courts was almost entirely conducted through luxury goods, jewels, plate, horses, and above all, textiles. Cloth of gold, brocaded silks, elaborate tapestries, finely embroidered gowns. This was not generosity. This was communication with a very large audience. When the Holy Roman Emperor sent a bolt of exceptional crimson silk to the King of England, he was saying several things at once. He was saying, I have the resources to produce or purchase this. I have the taste to know it is excellent. I have the political intention to honor you with it. I consider you worth this investment. He was also saying all of this in a public, visible, durable way, because when the King of England wore that silk at court, everyone who saw it could see what relationship it signified. Conversely, sending an inadequate gift cloth that was not luxurious enough, a color that was subtly wrong, a quantity that was insufficient for the occasion, was a studied insult, as carefully calculated as the compliment. Henry VIII was obsessive about textiles as diplomatic currency. His wardrobe accounts, which survive in extraordinary detail, show him spending more on fabric than on almost anything else, and his gift-giving and gift-receiving was tracked with the precision of a man who understood exactly what each transaction communicated. When Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and Katherine of Aragon's nephew, sent Henry an inadequate response to a major diplomatic initiative in 1527, the inadequacy of the accompanying gifts was read, correctly, as a signal that Charles was not impressed with Henry's leverage. Henry's advisors understood this. It shaped the subsequent negotiation. We think of diplomacy as words. In the medieval period, diplomacy was, at least as much, stuff, things. Objects that sat on bodies and in rooms and communicated constantly, to everyone who looked at them, about the relationships between the people who owned them. Why this matters, before we go further, one more thing to establish before we get into the specific cases, the queens and kings and spies and martyrs who fill the rest of this story. The coding and decoding of messages in medieval clothing was not a niche activity practiced by unusually clever people. It was not espionage in the modern, specialized sense. It was a widely distributed literacy that everyone with any education or court experience possessed. Ladies-in-waiting were trained to notice what their mistresses wore and to understand the implications. Ambassadors filed reports that included detailed descriptions of what the queen had been wearing when she received them. Chroniclers noted color choices at major public events because they understood these choices were intended to be noted. The Venetian ambassadors, the Bailli, were among the most acute observers in early modern Europe, and their dispatches home, filed regularly and preserved almost completely, are full of clothing observation. Who was wearing what when they met the English king? Whether the king's gown was new or recycled from a previous occasion? Who had appeared in mourning when they shouldn't have, or out of mourning when they should still have been in it? What colors the queen had chosen for a specific reception, and how that contrasted with what she'd worn the previous week. These men were professionals. They noticed clothing because clothing was information, not background detail, not color commentary. Primary source intelligence about the state of the court, the mood of the monarchy, the direction of policy. Which means that when we talk about hiding messages in clothing, we're talking about a practice that operated in plain sight. The hiding was not about concealment so much as about deniability. You could embroider a motto that meant two things at once. You could give a gift that communicated a threat without ever threatening anyone. You could wear a color that said something powerful and when questioned, smile and say it was simply your favorite. The clothing spoke, and no one could prove you'd made it talk. That's the game. Now let's watch the players play it. The stitch and the state embroidery as political technology. Let's talk about needlework, not as a craft, as a weapon. For most of modern history, the last 2 or 3 centuries, let's say, embroidery has been coded as feminine, domestic, innocent. Something women did in drawing rooms while the serious people did serious things nearby. This is one of the more spectacular misreadings of history we've managed to produce, and it starts to unravel the moment you look at what was actually being embroidered, by whom in the medieval and early modern period, and what happened to those who read it. Embroidery was, first of all, extraordinarily expensive, not just in materials, though silk thread and gold thread, and the elaborate fabrics on which fine embroidery was worked were costly enough, but in time. An accomplished embroiderer working on a complex commission might spend months or years on a single piece. The price of that time was built into the value of the finished object. A lavishly embroidered gown could cost more than a warhouse. An embroidered altar frontal could represent a year of labor by multiple skilled workers. Embroidery was luxury goods production, and the people who controlled it, both the patrons who commissioned it and the workshops that produced it, understood its significance. In royal and aristocratic households, embroidery was also, crucially, a domestic production. Ladies-in-waiting embroidered, queens embroidered. This was not just a pastime. It was a controlled environment for the production of meaningful objects, and the objects produced in that environment were seen, examined, given as gifts, displayed in public and read. The motto systems start with mottos because they're the most straightforward example of clothing as message, and they set the template for everything more complex. A motto was a short phrase, usually in Latin, sometimes in French, occasionally in English or Italian, that a person, family, or institution adopted as a kind of personal declaration. Mottos appeared on heraldic shields, on banners, on seals. They also appeared constantly on clothing, embroidered on collars, cuffs, belts, headbands, hems, stitched into the lining of cloaks where only the wearer would see them, or blazoned across the chest where no one could miss them. The genius of the motto system was ambiguity. A good motto could mean one thing to an uninformed observer and something entirely different, something subversive, something defiant, something dangerous to someone who knew the context. Katherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry VI, cast aside after 23 years of marriage when Henry decided he wanted Anne Boleyn, and more to the point, a male heir, adopted the motto humble and loyal during her years of increasing disgrace. Katherine was by disposition neither a political strategist nor a naturally combative person. She was devoutly religious, deeply formal, and had spent 2 decades trying to be a good English queen and a dutiful wife. But she was also the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and she understood power. Humble and loyal sounds like submission. In the context of the 1520s and 1530s, as Henry's attempts to annul the marriage escalated and Catherine's position became increasingly precarious, it was a challenge. Catherine was claiming the moral high ground. She was saying, "I am the humble one. I am the loyal one. Someone else is neither." She was saying it in gold thread on her sleeves, where every ambassador in every court in Europe could see it and understand the implied accusation. She wore it to public appearances. She had it worked into gifts. She had her ladies wear it. The motto traveled. It landed exactly where she intended. Papal correspondence from this period shows the Vatican understanding exactly what Catherine was signaling through her dress and her motto choices. She was framing herself as the legitimate, suffering, faithful party, and she was doing it with the deniability of embroidery thread. Henry could hardly arrest someone for a pious motto, but he could, and reportedly did, notice it. Anne Boleyn's counter-signaling, meanwhile, the woman in the process of displacing Catherine was running her own embroidery operation. Anne Boleyn was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a skilled diplomat, which meant she had grown up in a world of political signaling. She had spent years at the French court, the most sophisticated court in Europe for most of the early 16th century, where the political use of display was refined to an art form. She understood exactly what clothing communicated, and she used it with precision. Anne's motto was the most happy, a declaration of triumphant status that reads, in context, like a direct response to Catherine's humility. Where Catherine claimed virtue through suffering, Anne claimed legitimacy through joy. The fortune had chosen her. She wore it embroidered on her gowns and had it incorporated into the jewels she commissioned. Her famous bee necklace, the large pendant in the shape of her initial, hung with 3 pearls, visible in the Hever Castle portrait that is our best surviving image of her, was not ornamental. It was a brand. She wore it constantly, had it reproduced in multiple versions, gave versions of it as gifts. It made her initial visible, memorable, associated with richness and fashion and queenly status, in an era when her queenly status was still being bitterly contested, and the pearls mattered. Pearls were in the visual language of the 16th century, specifically associated with the Virgin Mary. They signified purity, virtue, divine favor. Hanging 3 pearls from her own initial was an audacious piece of iconographic appropriation. Anne, whose enemies called her a whore and whose marriage the Pope refused to recognize, dressed herself in the symbolic language of the Virgin. The message was, "I am not what you say I am." She couldn't say that in a speech. She could wear it. There's a documented episode from 1530 when Henry was still technically married to Catherine, and Anne's position remained formally undefined, in which Catherine sent Henry a gift, a cap she had made herself, worked with her personal embroidery. Henry sent it back. He had Anne's ladies return it with a pointed message. Catherine then sent another gift. There are hints in the correspondence of the period that what was being contested in these gift exchanges was not just affection but symbolic territory. Who had the right to dress the king, to work personal embroidery for him, to inhabit the intimate domestic space that a wife's needlework represented. Catherine was asserting her continuing status as wife. Henry's rejection was a statement. The needlework was the contested document. Mary Queen of Scots, the needle as argument now. The most extraordinary and most extensively documented case. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, former Queen of France, claimant to the English throne, Elizabeth I's nightmare, and the woman who finally walked into that great hall in red, spent 18 years as a political prisoner in England. From 1568, when she threw herself on Elizabeth's mercy after her second failed marriage and the revolt of her Scottish nobles, to 1587, when the mercy ran out, she was held in a series of castles and manor houses, her movements restricted, her correspondence monitored, her contact with the outside world increasingly controlled. During those 18 years, she embroidered, constantly, obsessively, in extraordinary volume and with extraordinary skill. The surviving pieces of Mary's embroidery, and there are significant surviving pieces, distributed between museums in Edinburgh, London, and various private collections, are remarkable objects. They include emblematic panels depicting animals and plants and moral symbols, worked in silk and sometimes gold thread on linen or canvas. They were given as gifts. They decorated her rooms. They were sent to her allies and to her enemies. They were noticed, described, collected, and argued over during her lifetime and for centuries afterward. And they were political documents. Mary and her ally and companion Bess of Hardwicke, the formidable countess who held her captive for several years at Chatsworth and later at Hardwicke Hall, worked on these panels together, and the subject matter was chosen with care. The source material included collections of natural emblems, emblem books, a popular Renaissance genre that paired images of animals, plants, and objects with moral or allegorical Latin mottos. Mary selected her subjects from these books, and the selections were not random. An emblem of a cat playing with a mouse, a phoenix rising from flames, a vine that grows through winter, a pruned tree that grows back stronger. These are not nature studies. In the emblem tradition that Mary and her literate correspondents knew intimately, each of these images carried a specific meaning, developed through a century of emblem literature that formed part of the intellectual furniture of every educated European court. The cat and mouse was a common emblem for a powerful ruler toying with a weaker opponent, which could represent Elizabeth playing with Mary, or read from Mary's perspective, herself waiting patiently for the moment to turn the tables. The phoenix was the emblem of resurrection, of rising from destruction. The vine and the pruned tree were emblems of endurance, of seeming setback that produces stronger growth. The emblems traveled. Mary gave them as gifts to her supporters, her French relatives, English Catholic nobles, foreign ambassadors who visited her. She sent them to her son James in Scotland. She included them in correspondence with the Duke of Guise and with the Spanish ambassador. Each piece was a communication, sent through the one-channel, personal gift, domestic craft, women's work, that her captors found hard to monitor and harder to intercept. Here is the specific piece that makes this absolutely clear. At some point during her captivity, historians debate the exact date, but most place it in the 1570s. Mary embroidered a panel depicting a hand holding a pruning knife and cutting the barren branches from a vine. The motto in Latin reads, "Virusit vulner virtus," virtue flourishes from wounding. Let that sit for a second. This is a woman who has been stripped of 2 kingdoms, imprisoned without trial, and watched her allies die, her cause erode, and her son grow up under Protestant supervision. She is communicating in a handmade textile sent as a gift to allies who understood the emblem language, that she is not broken, that the wounds are making her stronger, that she is still there, still fighting, still believing her cause will prevail. Her captors could look at it. They couldn't arrest her for it. It was a picture of gardening. Elizabeth's spymasters, Burghley, Walsingham, were not idiots. They understood what the embroideries were. They monitored the gifts. They occasionally intercepted them. They worried about them enough to repeatedly tighten the restrictions on what Mary could send and receive. But they couldn't confiscate needlework from a queen on purely political grounds without looking both tyrannical and absurd. The form protected the content. The casket and the coverlet there is one piece of Mary's embroidery that stands above the others, not for its quality, but for its specificity. During her imprisonment, Mary stitched a long piece of embroidery depicting the royal arms of Scotland and interleaved with them her own personal device, a combination of fleur-de-lis from her time as Queen of France, the Scottish lion and the arms of England, which she claimed as her own, as the legitimate Catholic heir to the English throne. The English arms, on her own needlework, on display in her rooms in an English castle, where English guards walked past it daily. You could read this as delusion, or as defiance, or as something more practical, a constant visible reminder to herself and to anyone who visited that she had not conceded her claim, that she still considered herself the rightful Queen of England, that the argument was not over. It was not a secret message. It was a flag, planted in silk thread in the middle of enemy territory by a woman who had lost almost everything except the capacity to stitch. The monk's habit and the hidden faith before we leave embroidery and move into the broader field of clothing as carrier. There's a subset of the story that deserves its own paragraph. Religious clothing was political clothing in the medieval and early modern period in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. The habit of a specific monastic order, the specific liturgical vestments of a priest, the devotional items worn on or near the body, these were not just expressions of private faith. They were visible statements of institutional allegiance, theological position, and in post-Reformation Europe, increasingly of political loyalty. In England, after Henry VII's break with Rome in 1534, and with increasing severity through the reign of Elizabeth I, being a practicing Catholic priest was effectively a capital crime. The laws of 1571 and 1585 made it treasonous simply to be an ordained Catholic priest on English soil. Men who became priests, particularly the young English Catholics who went to seminaries in Douai, Rome, and Valladolid, and returned to England to minister secretly to recusant households, knew they were risking execution. These priests did not wear vestments openly. They wore the clothes of gentlemen, of merchants, of servants, but they carried their priestly identity with them, sewn into the fabric of what they wore. Agnus Dei small wax medallions blessed by the Pope, often impressed with the image of the Lamb of God, were sewn into the linings of garments or worn on cords around the neck, hidden under shirts. Scapulars, small cloth panels bearing religious images, part of the devotional practice of various religious orders, were worn under secular clothing, against the skin, invisible to anyone not intimate enough to undress the wearer. The discovery of these objects during searches of suspect households was used as evidence. They were classified as popish trinkets in the legal language of the period, and their possession could be cited in prosecutions, so people hid them, in false bottomed hat boxes, in the lining of traveling trunks, on bodies under clothes. Father Edmund Campion, the Jesuit priest executed in 1581 for treason, his crime being the existence of his priesthood and his ministry to English Catholics, was betrayed partly through the investigation of his personal effects, the tracking of his movements by Walsingham's spy network, and eventually through a physical search that found hidden rooms in the houses he had visited. When he was searched at his arrest, his clothing was examined. What he carried on his body was documented. The clothing of a fugitive priest was evidence. The priests understood this. They developed elaborate systems for hiding vestments and liturgical equipment, a tiny portable mass kit, broken down into components that could be carried in different pockets and reassembled, so that no single item was incriminating on its own. They sewed letters inside hat brims and coat linings. They passed messages through the transfer of garments, a coat given to a servant in one house, collected by a specific person in another with the message inside. They used clothing as infrastructure. This is not metaphorical messaging. This is literal espionage, conducted through the medium of clothing by people who would hang and be drawn and be quartered if caught, and they were not caught often because the system worked. Colors that could kill you, the politics of pigment, and the dyes that started wars here is something that should not be surprising, but probably is. The color of your clothing in medieval and early modern Europe was not a style choice. It was a political statement, and depending on the statement it made, it could get you executed. We've touched on this in discussing sumptuary laws. But let's go deeper, because the color politics of this period are specific, documented, and absolutely extraordinary. Purple. The color that built an empire start with purple, because purple's story predates the medieval period but shapes everything that follows. Tyrian purple, the color produced from the mucus of the murex snail, specifically Murex brandaris and Hexaplex trunculus found in the eastern Mediterranean, was the most expensive textile color in the ancient world. By most expensive, we mean, in the Roman Empire, purple cloth sold for literally its weight in silver. The dye required thousands of snails to produce a few grams of colorant. The process was foul, the harvesting was labor-intensive, and the product was both brilliant and permanent in ways that plant dyes were not. The Roman Empire reserved purple, specific shades of it, for the emperor. Wearing imperial purple without permission was a capital offense. This was not about vanity. It was about visibility. The emperor needed to be the only person in the room who looked like an emperor. Purple was his uniform, his brand, his immediately recognizable claim to the highest status. When Rome fell, this association didn't disappear. It redistributed, transformed, and became one of the founding color politics of the medieval world. The Byzantine Empire maintained Roman purple for its emperors and imperial family with almost fanatical continuity. To be born in the purple, literally in the porphyra, the purple chamber of the Byzantine palace where empresses gave birth, was a mark of legitimacy so powerful that emperors born outside it were considered slightly lesser, a distinction that actually mattered in Byzantine succession politics. The Byzantine emperors also weaponized purple silk as diplomacy. They sent purple garments to foreign rulers as marks of honor, carefully calibrated marks of honor, because the specific shade and quantity of purple you received signaled exactly what relationship the emperor thought he had with you. More purple, better relationship. And crucially, these gifts were not just luxury. They communicated to every court in Europe what the emperor's assessment of the recipient's status was. When the Frankish kings received purple gifts from Byzantium, they displayed them. When they received less purple than they thought appropriate, they noticed. The purple did the talking. The medieval Western Church absorbed much of this. Cardinals' red, the scarlet worn by princes of the Catholic Church, was a deliberate echo of Roman imperial purple, adapted when true purple became too expensive and too associated with a rival power. Red achieved what purple had achieved. It was a restricted color that signaled the highest ecclesiastical status, recognizable at distance, and impossible to confuse with anything lower. And when European monarchs wanted to signal equivalence with imperial and ecclesiastical power, they reached for purple and red. Henry VII's famous portraits show him in crimson velvet. The choice was not about his favorite color. It was about what crimson said, visually, about the kind of king he intended to be. Saffron, gold, and the economics of yellow now move to a color that doesn't get enough attention: yellow. Yellow in the medieval period meant several different things depending on exactly which yellow you meant, and who was wearing it and where. Gold, the deep, warm yellow of cloth of gold, the woven metallic fabric that incorporated actual metal thread alongside silk, was restricted to the highest status by law and economics. Cloth of gold was ruinously expensive. The metal thread had to be individually spun, the weaving was technically demanding, and the results were so fragile that a cloth of gold gown might survive only a handful of wearings before the metal thread began to break and tarnish. You wore it because you could afford to ruin it. That was the point. Saffron, the deep orange-yellow produced from crocus stigmas, an equally expensive natural dye, had its own specific associations. In Ireland, for reasons that historians still debate, the laine, the traditional linen garment, was commonly dyed saffron. When the English administration tried to impose English dress on the Irish in the 16th century, the saffron linen became an explicit marker of Gaelic identity and resistance. Wearing it was a political statement. The English crown's repeated attempts to ban saffron garments in Ireland, an attempt that continued right through the 16th century, read now as almost comically futile, but they were absolutely serious at the time. The color was the resistance. Standard yellow, meanwhile, the cheaper yellows achievable with weld, broom, or other local plants, occupied a strange place in the medieval color hierarchy. In some contexts, yellow was associated with cowardice or exclusion. Jews in many parts of medieval Europe were required to wear a yellow badge, one of the origins of the yellow star, as a mark of difference. In other contexts, yellow was cheerful and festive. The difference was legible to medieval eyes in ways we've partly lost. The key point is this: there was no neutral yellow. Every color was encoded. Black, how Spain made mourning into power now black. Because black is where the story gets properly interesting and properly political. Black is not a natural, easy color to produce in textiles. Before the development of certain synthetic dyes in the 19th century, getting a true, rich, stable black required either significant quantities of iron-based mordants, which weaken the fiber, or expensive combinations of multiple dark dyes. Most black cloth in the medieval period was actually very dark blue or brown, and deteriorated toward those underlying colors over time. Real, stable black, the kind of black that stayed black through repeated wearing and washing, was expensive. And from around the mid-15th century onward, expensive black became something extraordinary. It became the power color of Europe's most powerful court. The Duchy of Burgundy and then the Spanish court that emerged from the Burgundian inheritance of the Habsburgs adopted black as their signature color. Not mourning black, or not only mourning black, but black as a statement of controlled, austere, intimidating power. The idea was this: we are so powerful that we do not need to advertise with color. Other courts dress their grandeur in crimson and gold. We wear black. The simplicity is the statement. This was brilliantly effective. The Spanish court under Charles V and Philip II developed an aesthetic of black severity, black velvet doublets, black silk skirts, black brocades with restrained gold embroidery that read across Europe as a visual signature of Habsburg power. It was so effective that it influenced court dress across the continent for generations. It also meant that black became politically coded in a specific way. Wearing Spanish-style black at the French court was a statement. It was wearing the clothes of a rival power, and everyone in the room knew what it said. When Mary I of England married Philip II of Spain in 1554, her court began shifting toward Spanish fashions. This was not just her personal taste, though she was genuinely Hispanophile. She'd grown up speaking Spanish, revering her Spanish mother. It was a political realignment visible in fabric. Her court began to look Spanish. The ambassadors noted it. The Protestant opposition noted it with alarm. The clothing was announcing a foreign policy. When Elizabeth I succeeded and reversed the alliance, the clothing reversed too. The Spanish black faded from the English court. The change was visible. It meant something. The white of widows and warriors' white is complicated. White meant purity, virginity, religious dedication, innocence. It also meant grief in many medieval traditions, where white rather than black was the mourning color. This persisted in France into the 16th century, which is why Mary Queen of Scots wore white mourning after her husband Francis II of France died in 1560. She was the Queen Dowager of France, following French custom, not trying to be eccentric. But white also meant surrender, and white meant peace, and white meant, in the very specific context of certain battles and negotiations, that you were claiming truce. And white, in the hands of Elizabeth I, became something else entirely. Elizabeth's use of white in her portraits is extraordinary and extraordinarily deliberate. The Ditchley portrait, the Armada portrait, the portraits from the 1590s when she was in her 60s, the Queen is consistently depicted in white and silver, ornamented with jewels, surrounded by symbolism. The white communicated virginity, the Virgin Queen, purity of rule, divine favor. It also communicated to the initiated a connection to the moon, Diana, Cynthia, Astrea, the classical goddesses of virginity, and the moon with which Elizabeth's court poets obsessively associated her. White was her brand. She used it to construct and maintain a specific political mythology around her person. She wore it to major occasions and had her portraits painted in it, knowing that those portraits would travel to every court in Europe as diplomatic documents. She was 55 years old, and she was wearing white virginity on her body as a declaration of permanent power. Green and the language of love and its opposite, green deserves a paragraph, because green did something specific. In medieval lyric poetry and romance tradition, and remember that this tradition was not just entertainment, but part of the shared cultural vocabulary of every literate court person, green was the color of love, of new love specifically, fresh and growing and not yet settled. Green was spring, green was youth, green was hope. Wearing green to a specific occasion could signal romantic availability or romantic interest. Giving a green gift, a green ribbon, a green embroidered item could signal the beginning of a courtship. The recipient knew what it meant. It was part of the shared reading, which means that strategically not wearing green could be a message too. And wearing it when you weren't supposed to, say, if you were the king's mistress and he had recently lost interest, and you appeared in green as if to say, I am available, I am young, I am beginning, watch me, that was a move. We don't have smoking gun documented cases of exactly this game being played, but we have the framework. And we have the contemporaries describing people's clothing choices as meaningful in ways that only make sense if this reading was active and understood. John Lydgate's poetry, the various etiquette manuals, the Roman de la Rose tradition that permeated elite culture, all of it assumes a fluent color reader. The audience knew green meant love. The people dressing for court knew the audience knew. The pocket and the paper literal hidden messages and how they actually worked. Now we get to the part people always want to know about. The actual, physical, literal hiding of written messages inside clothing. Because yes, it happened. Extensively, systematically, ingeniously, and the mechanics are fascinating. The problem of communication in a monitored world. First, understand the problem. If you were a medieval or early modern royal or noble with something politically sensitive to communicate, say you were Mary Queen of Scots trying to correspond with foreign powers while imprisoned in England, or you were a Catholic priest trying to coordinate a network of safe houses, or you were a noble who had secretly backed the wrong side in a succession crisis and needed to warn your allies without your letters being intercepted, you faced a serious practical problem. All correspondence passed through intermediaries. There were no postal services in the modern sense. Letters were carried by servants, by merchants, by travelers. If your letter was intercepted, it was read. If it was written in a way that was obviously in code, that itself was evidence. And by the 16th century, the English Crown's intelligence operation under Walsingham had people watching the obvious routes, the major roads, the ports, the houses of known recusants. A suspicious-looking letter carried by a suspicious-looking messenger would not get far. What you needed was either an unbreakable code or a perfect carrier. The most reliable codes of the period, letter substitution ciphers, word lists, null characters, were good but not perfect, and decryption techniques improved throughout the 16th century. Walsingham's team broke Mary's codes repeatedly, though it took time and skill. The perfect carrier, meanwhile, was the one who didn't look like they were carrying anything at all. And the best disguise for something you're carrying is to make it part of your body, specifically part of your clothing. The technology of concealment, the basic concealment technology, was remarkably varied. Hat brims were the most obvious concealment location for the simple reason that hat brims of the period, particularly the wide-brimmed styles fashionable among gentlemen, were frequently doubled or padded, creating a natural cavity. A tightly rolled letter, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect against moisture, could fit inside a hat brim and be virtually undetectable to anyone not specifically searching for it. And why would you specifically search someone's hat brim? Documented use. In the aftermath of the Ridolfi plot of 1571, the conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary Queen of Scots, Walsingham's investigation uncovered evidence that letters had been carried between the conspirators in, among other places, hat brims. The carrier was not a suspicious person. He was a merchant with ordinary business reasons for travel. His hat brim was not checked. The letters got through. Until the plot was betrayed by other means, at which point the whole network was unwound and the Duke of Norfolk ended up on the scaffold. But the hat brim worked. Shoe heels, another obvious but effective location. The thick heels of the period's footwear, particularly the raised heels that became fashionable from the late 16th century onward, could be hollowed and fitted with a concealed space. The documents this space could carry were small, but small was often enough: a cipher key, a list of names, a single critical word. Wigs and hair, not quite clothing, but in the same conceptual territory. Elaborate hairstyles, increasingly common from the 16th century onward, and the wigs and hairpieces that supplemented them, offered concealment space. A tightly rolled note could be fixed into dressed hair or a hairpiece. It would not survive searching, but it was unlikely to be searched. The lining of cloaks and outer garments, here the technology was more interesting. Tailors were involved. A A skilled tailor could construct a garment with a concealed inner pocket or a false lining that was effectively undetectable unless you knew what to look for and were willing to rip the garment apart. False hems, a hem that looked like a single layer of fabric but was in fact a tube with an opening at one end, were used for letters. False collars, false cuffs. These were labor-intensive constructions, requiring a tailor who was both skilled and discreet, but they were durable and reliable. The most sophisticated version of this was the garment that was constructed to carry specific things, the garment that was, from the beginning, designed as a carrier. This appears in documentation of the Jesuit missions to England, where priests needed to carry both messages and liturgical objects through border searches. Their tailors, often themselves recusant Catholics in Catholic households on the continent, produced garments that were specifically designed for concealment. Embroidery as code, and now we're back to embroidery, but in a different mode. There's a documented practice, most clearly attested in early modern Italy but present across Europe, of embedding actual coded information in embroidery patterns. Not metaphorical messages through symbol selection, but literal numerical or alphabetical codes worked into what looked like purely decorative geometric patterns. The technique worked by treating the embroidery as a matrix. Specific stitches in specific positions encoded characters. A simple version: count the stitches in each row, convert numbers to letters, read the message. A more sophisticated version used a separately distributed key, a piece of paper that told you which stitch positions corresponded to which characters. Without the key, the embroidery looked like embroidery. With the key, it was a document. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, but widely repeated in both contemporary and subsequent sources, of a Spanish noblewoman in the court of Philip II who passed messages to her lover using embroidered handkerchiefs, with each stitch pattern corresponding to coded characters agreed in advance. The story may be romantic exaggeration, but the technique it describes is technically sound and historically plausible. Mary's actual methods. Let's be specific about Mary Queen of Scots, because her case is the most extensively documented. After the discovery of the Ridolfi plot, Mary's captivity was tightened significantly. Her correspondence was more actively monitored. The interception and copying of her letters became systematic, and by the 1580s, with the arrival of Francis Walsingham's most elaborate operation, the intelligence network around her was among the most sophisticated in Europe. Walsingham understood that Mary had continued correspondence with her supporters despite the restrictions. He needed to know the content of that correspondence. His solution was elegant and brutal in equal measure. He arranged for a double agent, a brewer named Gilbert Gifford, to offer his services as a messenger to Mary's contact in France, Thomas Morgan. Gifford proposed a method of communicating that he presented as secure: letters enclosed in a waterproof packet hidden inside the bung of a beer barrel, which would be delivered to Mary's prison at Chartley Manor. Mary used the method eagerly. She had been largely cut off, and she seized the chance to communicate. What she didn't know was that Walsingham's team was intercepting every letter, copying it, resealing it in a forgery of the original seal, and then delivering it. For months, they read everything that came in and went out. They learned the extent of the Babington plot, the conspiracy to kill Elizabeth, and they read it in Mary's own words, in her own replies, in her explicit approval of the assassination plan. This is why the Babington plot destroyed her. Not because the clothing concealment methods failed, those had been working. but because she trusted a channel that had been compromised from the beginning. But here's the clothing detail that matters. In the period before Gifford's involvement, Mary had been using clothing as a carrier. Her ladies-in-waiting, coming and going with more freedom than Mary herself, carried letters in their clothing. Specific documented methods include notes written on extremely thin paper, rolled tightly, sealed in wax to protect against moisture, and concealed in the boning channels of stays, the stiff corset-like garment worn by women of the period, constructed with channels containing strips of bone or wood, channels that were naturally about the right size for a rolled note. Messages sewn into the seams of garments being sent to or from Mary's household under the pretense of laundering or alteration. And most fascinatingly, embroidered items sent to allies with encoded messages in the stitch patterns, or with hidden notes sewn behind the backing cloth. The Walsingham Papers, a substantial archive preserved in the British Library and the Public Record Office, contain references to intercepted letters and suspicious packages from Mary's household, some of which describe the concealment methods used. These are not speculative. They are documented in the records of England's most sophisticated intelligence operation. The letter inside the gift, there's a class of concealed message that doesn't fit neatly into clothing, but is adjacent to it in a meaningful way. The message inside the gift. Gift giving was, as we've discussed, a primary channel of court communication, and the gift was frequently textiles or clothing, gloves, scarves, embroidered sleeves, elaborate gowns sent between allies. The physical object could carry a literal message as well as a symbolic one. A documented example, during the various negotiations around the potential marriage of Elizabeth I, which occupied decades of her reign, gifts were constantly exchanged with potential suitors. When the Duke of Alençon, Francis, Duke of Anjou, Elizabeth's last serious marriage prospect, was pursuing her in the late 1570s and early 1580s, the gifts exchanged between them were closely tracked by both courts. Each gift was an argument. Each delay in reciprocating was a negotiating move. There are hints in the correspondence of the period, from both the English and French sides, that specific items exchanged between Elizabeth and her suitors carried accompanying messages not in the accompanying letter, which would be monitored, but inside the package itself. A note tucked inside a glove, inside the finger. A slip of paper inside the box containing a jewel. This is harder to document definitively because by definition it worked best when it wasn't documented, but the practice is referenced often enough in the correspondence of intermediaries to be confident it was real. The glove and its meanings. Gloves deserve a specific section because they were, in the court culture of the period, among the most loaded clothing items of all. Gloves were intimate. They touched the skin. They were frequently perfumed. They were given as gifts between intimates and between strangers in ways that were loaded with significance. A queen giving a glove to someone, actually removing her glove and handing it to them, was a mark of extraordinary favor. A knight wearing his lady's glove as a favor in a tournament was declaring allegiance both personal and political. Gloves were also where you could hide things. The fingers of a well-made glove of the period, particularly the elaborate perfumed and embroidered gloves that were fashionable luxury goods, were exactly the right size to contain a tightly rolled note. Gloves were personal enough to pass between people without obvious inspection, because inspecting someone's gift was rude. The deliberate use of gloves as carriers is documented in espionage literature of the period. One of the techniques described in later accounts of Elizabethan intelligence work, accounts that draw on contemporary documentation, involves the use of specially constructed gloves with concealed cavities in the wrist section, above the cuff. These are not just folk memory. They appear in enough independent sources to be credible. Catherine de' Medici, the Florentine Queen of France, mother of 3 kings, and one of the great political operators of the 16th century, was associated in her own lifetime with the use of perfumed gloves as gifts. She was rumored to have poisoned enemies via poisoned gloves, a rumor that was almost certainly false in its specific details, but reflected the general understanding that gloves were an intimate gift that could carry things other than warmth. Whether the rumors were true is irrelevant. What matters is that contemporaries believed they might be true, which means they understood gloves as potential carriers. The belief reflects the reality of the practice. The badge and the betrayal heraldry, livery, and the factions that wore their wars on their sleeves. Let's talk about the Wars of the Roses, because there is no better case study in the political weaponization of clothing, specifically of heraldic colors and badges, in the whole of medieval history. England between 1455 and 1485 was not so much a country as a civil war with architecture. The Lancastrian and Yorkist branches of the Plantagenet dynasty spent 30 years trying to kill each other for the crown, and the English nobility was forced into a series of increasingly dangerous decisions about which side to back. These decisions were marked, literally marked, in the badges they wore. Reading the field, imagine you are a middling knight in England in, say, 1460. You have a castle, some land, some tenants. You are technically sworn to the king, who is at the moment Henry VI of Lancaster, a gentle, pious, intermittently insane man who cannot manage his own court, let alone a kingdom in revolt. Against him stands Richard, Duke of York, and after York's death at the Battle of Wakefield, his son Edward, who will become Edward IV. You need to choose. And you need to communicate your choice, visibly, because the communication of allegiance is almost as important as the allegiance itself. Your men need to know who they're fighting for. The men they're fighting against need to know who they're fighting against. The great lords who might offer you protection or patronage need to know where you stand before they do. You communicate in badges. The Red Rose of Lancaster was not actually the primary badge of the Lancastrian cause during the wars that came later, largely as Tudor retrospective branding. The real Lancastrian badge was the swan of the Bohun inheritance, or the antelope, or the spotted beast, depending on the specific branch. The Yorkists used the white rose, the sun in splendor, the falcon and fetterlock. And scattered throughout the conflict were the badges of great magnates, the bear and ragged staff of the Earls of Warwick, the Stafford knot of the Dukes of Buckingham, the Beauchamp cross, each representing a network of retainers whose loyalty was to that particular lord, and through him to one side of the larger conflict. When the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, Richard Neville, the most powerful magnate in England, switched sides in 1470, abandoning the Yorkist cause he'd helped create to restore Henry VI, the switch was visible. His men changed badges. The bear and ragged staff appeared in the wrong army. Contemporaries described this. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. And when Warwick died at Barnet in 1471, on a battlefield where his own men couldn't distinguish his forces from the enemy in the fog, a famous, terrible incident that came down to a failure of visual identification, a misread badge. The consequences were immediate, total, and fatal. Warwick's men attacked Warwick's other men. The Yorkists held. Henry VI was deposed and would be dead within the month. A battle lost to a misread badge. The livery and the law, the political dangers of the livery system became so extreme during this period that, after the Wars of the Roses ended, Henry VII, the first Tudor, the man who ended the conflict by winning at Bosworth in 1485 and marrying a Yorkist princess, made dismantling the system one of his primary goals. Livery and maintenance, the practice of great lords distributing their colors to large bodies of retainers who would maintain, support, testify fight for those lords in any conflict, had essentially enabled the wars. The great magnates had private armies dressed in their colors. These armies were loyal to their lord, not to the crown. The crown was whoever that lord decided deserved it. Henry VII attacked this systematically. Legislation against unlicensed livery distribution was enacted and enforced with unusual vigor. The fines were substantial. The prosecutions were real. When the Earl of Oxford was caught hosting the king for several days and sending him off with 2,000 retainers all in Oxford livery, a show of personal power that was simultaneously a violation of the statutes, Henry fined him £15,000, a staggering sum. Oxford supposedly replied that it had been worth it just to see the king's face at the display. Henry took the money anyway. The point was not entirely to eliminate the power of the nobles. The point was to put the visible communication of that power under royal control. You could have retainers. You couldn't dress them in your colors without permission, because dressed retainers were an army, and an army in your colors was a political statement that might become a military threat. The clothing was the threat. The regulation was a response to the threat. The Tudor rose and the politics of rebranding, and then Henry did something brilliant. He invented a badge. The Tudor rose, the composite white over red rose that combined Lancastrian red and Yorkist white, was not a natural heraldic development. It was a deliberate political construction, a piece of symbolic engineering designed to claim both warring traditions and present them as resolved. Henry was Lancastrian on his father's side, loosely. The connection was through an illegitimate line. His wife Elizabeth was Yorkist. Their union was presented as the union of the roses, the end of the conflict, the restoration of peace, and he put this on everything, on clothing, on coins, on buildings, on tapestries. He had the combined rose worked into the decoration of his palaces, his household furnishings, the embroidered goods his workshops produced. He created a visual vocabulary of resolution that appeared wherever the Tudor household appeared. This was not incidental decoration. This was state-sponsored messaging through fabric and stone and metal, executed with the same intention and the same understanding of visual language that had made the badge wars possible in the first place. Henry had learned from the Civil War exactly how powerful visual symbols were, and he used that knowledge to paper over the conflict that had brought him to power. The Tudor rose is still visible everywhere, on buildings, on documents, on the pound coin for decades. We see it as tradition. It was originally a piece of political crisis management, stitched into every surface available. Richard II and the danger of too many badges. Let's go back further, because the badge story didn't start with the Wars of the Roses. It started, in its most extreme form in English history, with Richard II, and it's a story about a king who understood the power of clothing so well that his understanding killed him. Richard II reigned from 1377 to 1399. He was, by several contemporary accounts, obsessive about aesthetic presentation in a way that distinguished him sharply from his predecessors and made his contemporaries deeply uncomfortable. He cared about his clothes. He cared about the clothes of his court. He had views on fabric and color and ornamentation that struck his barons as dangerously unmasculine, insufficiently martial, too focused on display. He was also, not coincidentally, one of the most politically intelligent monarchs of his era, and his aesthetic obsessions were not separate from his political intelligence. They were part of it. Richard's white hart. This is the device, a white stag, often with a golden crown and chain, that Richard adopted as his personal badge. He distributed it on an extraordinary scale. The tournament at Smithfield in 1390, where he held court and celebrated with elaborate pageantry, reportedly saw 30,000 white hart badges distributed to spectators and participants. 30,000. The number is probably inflated, but the scale was unprecedented and deliberate. He was creating a visual identity that was personally his, not his dynasty's heraldic arms, not a feudal badge distributed by a magnate, but his, the king's, a direct link between every person wearing it and Richard's own person. He was trying to create a mass following, a popular base, a visual network of royal loyalists that would bypass the traditional noble intermediaries who kept inserting themselves between the king and his people. His opponents, the Lords Appellant, the powerful magnates who challenged his authority, understood what he was doing. They were furious. They forced him into a period of humiliation in 1388, executing his close associates and constraining his power. Richard accepted it, waited, and spent the next decade building his revenge. He rebuilt his power base. He struck in 1397, arresting and executing the Lords Appellant's leaders. And he continued distributing his white hart on a scale that alarmed everyone who was paying attention. Then Henry Bolingbroke, exiled Lancastrian claimant, landed in England while Richard was campaigning in Ireland. Richard's support evaporated. The white hart badges, it turned out, were not the same as loyalty. The men wearing them went to Bolingbroke. Richard was captured, imprisoned, and was almost certainly dead by February 1400, murdered, starved, or simply stripped of the will to live in Pontefract Castle. The specific mechanism is not documented. His white hart survives. The famous Wilton diptych, painted during his reign, probably in the 1390s, one of the most extraordinary medieval paintings to survive, shows Richard kneeling before the Virgin and Child, surrounded by saints. He wears a gown embroidered with white hearts. The angels around the Virgin wear white heart badges. The badge is everywhere. Even in religious painting, Richard was branding himself, connecting himself visually to divine protection. He was right about the power of visual communication. He was wrong about the power it gave him over reality. The badge was a claim. It was not by itself sufficient to make the claim true. The execution dress, what you wore to your own death, and why it mattered, scaffold dressing. This is where the story goes quiet, and where the political use of clothing becomes something almost unbearably specific. Because the scaffold, the public execution platform where medieval and early modern Europe settled its most extreme political arguments, was a theater. It was, by design, a performance. The condemned person made a speech, asked for forgiveness, prayed publicly, demonstrated appropriate or not contrition. The crowd watched. Representatives of the crown watched. Ambassadors sometimes watched. Witnesses wrote accounts that circulated in manuscript and print. In that theater, clothing was the costume, and the choice of costume was the last act of political communication available to the person being executed. Anne Boleyn, May 19, 1536. Anne Boleyn was executed on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, charges that were almost certainly fabricated, orchestrated by her enemies and by a king who had tired of her and wanted to be free of her so he could marry Jane Seymour. She had given Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, and no living son, and this failure had been compounded by a miscarriage in January 1536 that may have been a malformed fetus. Later sources claim it appeared to show signs of developmental abnormality, and Henry had apparently decided, sometime in early 1536, that he was done. The trial was a grotesque proceeding. The evidence was thin. Several of the men accused with her were almost certainly innocent. She was convicted in 3 days. She was executed on the morning of May 19, 1536, in the presence of about 200 witnesses, a small, controlled audience, not the public crowds that attended executions at Tyburn. The venue was the Tower Green, inside the Tower of London. She wore a gown of dark gray damask, not black, not the brightest scarlet she might have worn to court, dark, but not the absolute black of official mourning. Some accounts say she wore a red kirtle, a red underdress, beneath it. The red, if it was there, would have been visible only at the moment her outer gown was removed for the execution, when it would be vivid against the scaffold. She had chosen the color scheme. She had dressed herself knowing it would be the last thing people saw and described. The darkness of the outer gown, not the flamboyant color she had worn at court, not the queenly gold and crimson, communicated a kind of dignified severity. She was not performing triumph. She was not performing lamentation. She was performing composure. Her speech on the scaffold was brief, careful, and conspicuously did not claim innocence. She said only that she came to die as the law had determined and asked for mercy on her soul. But the clothing performed something that the speech could not say directly. I was a queen. I am a queen. What you are doing to me is what you do to queens. The dark damask was queenly fabric. She wore it to her death to refuse to look like a criminal. Catherine Howard, February 13, 1542. Catherine Howard was 19 when she was executed, possibly younger. She was Henry VII's fifth wife, accused of adultery. The evidence, unlike in Anne's case, suggests she genuinely had prior relationships that she had not disclosed to Henry, though whether she was guilty of adultery after the marriage is a separate and murkier question. Henry at this point was obese, ill, bad-tempered, and genuinely horrified at what he'd been told about her past. She was executed at the Tower alongside her lady-in-waiting Jane Boleyn, the Viscountess Rochford, who had given damaging and probably false testimony at Anne Boleyn's trial and was now caught up in her own disaster. Catherine spent her last night requesting that the execution block be brought to her room so she could practice positioning herself upon it correctly. This is one of the most heartbreaking details in all of this history. She was terrified that she wouldn't do it right. She was a teenager who had been put on trial for her life, and what she focused on in her last night alive was performing correctly. She wore a black gown, simple, unadorned. Her youth, her absolute youth, was the statement her clothing couldn't make. She was barely out of childhood, dressed in adult black, dying for the marriage she'd been pushed into by ambitious relatives who had used her as a bargaining chip. There is not very much political messaging in Catherine's scaffold dress, and that absence is its own kind of message. She was not a political actor. She was a victim of political maneuvering. Her clothing, in its simplicity, in its absence of calculated statement, is in retrospect one of the most accurate reflections of what she actually was. A young woman killed by a system she had never controlled. Lady Jane Grey, February 12, 1554. Jane Grey is one of the most troubling cases in this whole history. because she was executed for being used as a tool, not for anything she actually did. She was 16 when she was placed on the throne by the Duke of Northumberland, who had manipulated the dying Edward VI into altering the succession in her favor, bypassing the Catholic Mary Tudor. She was queen for 9 days. Then Mary arrived with an army, the support evaporated, and Jane was arrested, tried, and eventually executed, not immediately, but after Wyatt's rebellion in early 1554 made Mary's advisors decide that keeping Jane alive was too dangerous. She walked to the scaffold on the morning of February 12th wearing a black gown. She was recorded as carrying an open prayer book. She made a short speech reaffirming her Protestant faith and denying any treasonous intent. Her composure, described by all witnesses, was apparently extraordinary. Her black gown. In the context of Protestant England, the faith she was dying for, the faith that Mary was systematically dismantling, black had a specific resonance. Protestant dress tended towards sobriety. The elaborate, colorful, bejeweled display of the Catholic and secular court was not what Protestant piety looked like. Protestant piety looked like simple dark cloth, like the modest, unornamented black that distinguished the Reformed from the Old Faith. Jane dressed as a Protestant martyr. She dressed as the thing she was being killed for being. The black gown was a theological statement and a political statement at once. She was the scholar who wrote her own death speech in the margins of a prayer book, her final written document addressed to her sister Katherine. She was the 16-year-old who dressed for her execution with the same careful intention that she brought to everything else. The clothing was a thought-out choice. It said, "I died for this. I believe this. This is who I was. Mary Queen of Scots, February 8, 1587," and then read, "We started here. Let's close the loop with the full detail." Mary had spent the night before her execution writing letters to her brother-in-law Henry III of France, to Philip II of Spain, to the Pope. She distributed her belongings to her servants. She ate nothing or very little. She prayed. The room in which she dressed herself, in the castle at Fotheringhay, was attended by her ladies. She had sent abroad for specific items in the months before. There is evidence she had been planning this appearance for some time. She had chosen deliberately, before she knew the specific date, what she would wear. The outer gown she entered the hall in was black, the conventional color of grief and gravity, appropriate, expected. When she removed her outer gown as part of the procedure, the executioner was supposed to do this, but she helped because she was in a hurry. She later said, having performed this undressing many times, what was underneath was everything. A bodice of crimson velvet, crimson petticoats, crimson sleeves. And later discovered and described by witnesses, crimson stockings, the underwear of a Catholic martyr. The sources are explicit. The color was noticed and described in the accounts written within days of the execution by the witnesses, Protestant and Catholic alike. The Protestant accounts are more constrained. They describe it but don't make much of it. The Catholic accounts understand it immediately. She was wearing the color of the blood of martyrs. She was visually claiming the status of a holy death, a death for the faith. She also, and this is less often noted, wore around her neck a necklace of Agnus Dei. And in the moments after the beheading, when the executioner held up her head, standard procedure to demonstrate to the witnesses that the deed was done, her wig came off. Beneath it, her actual hair, close cropped and gray. She had been wearing her wig as the outer layer, the presentation face. The hair beneath was the truth of an aging, ill woman who had spent 18 years in prison. The red was the message. The gray hair was the reality. Together they were the complete argument. I was real. I suffered. I believed. Remember me. Catholic Europe remembered her. She became a martyr figure in the counter-Reformation literature of the late 16th century, a queen who died for the faith. The portraits of her in red started appearing within years of her death. Her execution clothing was what framed the image. The queen's jewels and what they said wearing relationships on your body, wearing threats around your neck jewelry is clothing adjacent, worn on the body, part of a planned overall effect, encoded with meaning. And in the medieval and early modern period, jewelry was possibly even more loaded with significance than fabric, because jewelry was durable, valuable, and portable in ways fabric was not. Royal jewelry was, above all, dynastic. The great pieces, the crowns, the necklaces, the brooches that appeared in portraits and were catalogued in treasuries, were not personal purchases. They were inherited, or they were gifts with specific political significance, or they were created to mark specific political occasions, and their histories traveled with them. The necklace that became a cause. Let's start with one of the most famous pieces of jewelry in European history, which became famous precisely because of what happened to it. The affair of the diamond necklace. Paris, 1784. The queen is Marie Antoinette. The necklace is a spectacular piece, a multiple-strand diamond collar of extraordinary extravagance, originally commissioned for Louis XV's last mistress, Madame du Barry, but never delivered because Louis died before it was completed. The jewelers, desperate to recoup their investment, tried to sell it to the new queen. Marie Antoinette refused it. At 1.6 million livres, it was outrageously expensive even for a French queen, and she was already aware that her reputation for extravagance was a political liability. She said no. Then a confident scheme of nearly inconceivable ambition. A fraudster named Jean de la Motte convinced a credulous cardinal, the Cardinal de Rohan, that Marie Antoinette secretly wanted the necklace and would buy it through him as an intermediary. She did this by forging letters from the queen in the queen's name, staging a fake secret meeting in the gardens of Versailles at night using a prostitute disguised as the queen, and having Rohan purchase the necklace on credit on Marie Antoinette's supposed behalf. The necklace disappeared. The fraud unraveled. Rohan was arrested. La Motte was arrested, tried, and branded. And Marie Antoinette, who was entirely innocent, was ruined. The scandal attached to the necklace, a necklace she had never owned, never worn, never touched, became one of the central events in the destruction of her reputation in the years before the Revolution. Pamphlets described her as corrupt, adulterous, secretly purchasing obscene luxury while the French people starved. The necklace she didn't have became the emblem of everything her enemies said she was. Jewelry communicated reputation. Even jewelry that was absent communicated reputation. What you were associated with wearing was as powerful as what you actually wore. Earlier, the jewel as diplomatic document back further. The medieval and early modern courts used jewelry in ways that are very specifically documented as diplomatic communication. When Henry VIII was pursuing his divorce from Katherine of Aragon and his marriage to Anne Boleyn, the question of what happened to the royal jewels was a matter of extraordinary political sensitivity. The jewels of the English crown, many of them, had been brought to England by Catherine's mother, Isabella of Castile, as part of Catherine's dowry. They were, in a technical legal sense, contested territory. As Anne's position moved from mistress to fiancée to queen, Henry began moving the jewels. Catherine had worn them as queen. Now Henry demanded them back, and they began appearing in portraits of Anne. This was not private. Everyone saw it. The jewels were visible proof of the transfer of status. When contemporaries wrote about Anne supplanting Catherine, they often mentioned the jewels. They were the concrete form of the claim. Catherine refused to return some items. Henry sent people to physically collect them. The episode is described in multiple sources as humiliating and brutal. The physical stripping of Queen's jewelry from a woman who was still legally the Queen to give it to the woman Henry wanted to replace her with. In 1534, Catherine wrote to the Holy Roman Emperor, her nephew Charles V, about the jewels, making the political argument explicit. The removal of the Queen's jewels was the removal of her queenly status, visible to the whole court, announced in the language everyone could read. Elizabeth and the pearls of Mary Queen of Scots here is a specific case that is both dark and extraordinary. After Mary's execution, her considerable jewelry collection, she had been a Queen of France and Scotland and had assembled beautiful things over her lifetime, even if much of it had been stripped from her during her captivity, was distributed. Many pieces went to Elizabeth I, who was not above accepting the spoils. Among the pieces Elizabeth acquired was a set of large black pearls, an extraordinary collection that Mary had brought with her from France and had treasured throughout her captivity. Elizabeth subsequently appeared wearing them. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Elizabeth was wearing the jewelry of the woman she had executed. In the visual language of the period, this was a statement of victory, of inheritance, of the transfer of status from the dead woman to the living. Mary's allies in France and Scotland understood it as such. There is a painting from the late 1580s showing Elizabeth in what appear to be these pearls. Whether the identification is correct or not, the point is that contemporaries were tracking this, noticing what Elizabeth wore and asking whether it had belonged to Mary. The attention itself tells you something about how people understood jewelry as communication. Anne of Cleves and the portrait that lied a slightly different angle, the jewel and the diplomatic portrait, and what happens when the portrait deceives. In 1539, Henry VIII was looking for a fourth wife. Anne of Cleves was proposed, a princess from a German Protestant duchy, a politically useful alliance. Henry sent his court painter Hans Holbein to produce a portrait so he could see what he was getting. Holbein produced a beautiful painting. Anne in the portrait is serene, dignified, elegantly dressed in the German fashion, which was quite different from the English and French fashions Henry knew, and covered more of the figure and face. The jewels she wears in the portrait are modest but elegant. She looks pleasant. Henry agreed to the match. When Anne arrived in England in late December 1539, Henry was apparently horrified. He found her physically unattractive. His words, subsequently reported, were not kind. He went through with the marriage but found it unbearable and had it annulled within 6 months on the grounds of non-consummation, which was probably true. What had happened? Holbein had painted a flattering portrait. This was not unusual. Portrait artists painted to flatter. But the German fashion in which Anne was dressed in the portrait concealed more than English fashion would have, and the conventions of portraiture idealized. Henry had relied on a painted image as a substitute for seeing the real person, and the image had oversold the product. Anne, for her part, was apparently a perfectly pleasant, sensible woman who took the annulment with remarkable good grace, accepted a pension and properties, and lived quietly in England until 1557. Henry called her his dear sister. He may have felt guilty. The portrait was a diplomatic lie. The clothing in the portrait was part of the lie. It concealed, it presented, it shaped perception. And when the reality behind the clothing was different from the presentation, the political consequences were real. The spy in the seams Elizabeth's intelligence network, and the people who hid in plain sight. Now let's talk about actual spycraft. Not the romantic version, not black cloaks and poison rings and elaborate mechanical devices. The real version, which was messier, more mundane, more dependent on human courage and human error, and which used clothing as one of its primary tools. Francis Walsingham, principal secretary to Elizabeth I from 1573 to 1590, built the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in Elizabethan England, and possibly in the whole of early modern Europe. He spent his own money on it. He recruited at least 50 agents, some of whom operated inside the courts of France, Spain, and the Low Countries. He ran double agents against Mary Queen of Scots, against the Catholic seminaries on the continent, against the Spanish embassy in London. He was, by the standards of his time, genuinely brilliant at it, and his people used clothing, constantly, as concealment, as cover, as carrier. The agent in plain clothes, Walsingham's agents, were not visibly agents. They were merchants, diplomats, scholars, travelers, servants. The cover was the clothing. You dressed as what you were pretending to be, and you dressed convincingly, because a gentleman who dressed like a merchant but moved like a gentleman would be noticed. This sounds obvious, but it required logistical support. An agent being inserted into, say, a Catholic household in the Spanish Netherlands needed appropriate clothing for the role he was playing. If he was playing a wool merchant, he needed to look like a wool merchant, specific fabrics, specific cuts, the absence of the luxury accessories that would mark a gentleman, a specific kind of travel-worn practicality. If he was playing a scholar, different clothing, the gown, the specific kind of dark academic dress that a university-educated man wore. Walsingham's operations involved, among other things, ensuring that his people had appropriate clothing for their covers. This is mentioned obliquely in several surviving letters from the period, references to the cost of fitting out an agent for a specific mission, which included clothing as part of the expense. The double agent Christopher Marlowe, if you believe the theory, and it's not proven, that the playwright was also an Elizabethan spy, provides a useful example of how this worked in practice. Whatever his intelligence connections, Marlowe spent time in France at Douai, the Catholic seminary producing priests for the English mission. He was apparently a convincing enough Catholic student to move freely in those circles, which required both the correct religious behaviors and the correct dress. He wore the student's gown. He looked the part. Looking the part in a world of visual reading was almost as good as being the part. The double agent's problem. The double agent had a specific clothing problem that the straight agent didn't face. They needed to look convincing in two different worlds, sometimes in rapid alternation. A Walsingham agent who was embedded in a Catholic network in England, attending Mass at a recusant household, moving in circles where being Protestant would be instantly dangerous, needed to be able to produce Catholic devotional objects, wear Catholic-coded clothing, the Agnus Dei, the scapular, the rosary tucked into a pocket, and behave in every way like a committed Catholic. Then, when reporting to Walsingham, they needed to be able to credibly claim their Protestant loyalties and their loyalty to the crown. The material props of this performance, the devotional objects, the clothing, were part of the evidence of their cover. When the government searched a suspect's lodgings and found Catholic devotional material, they used it as evidence of recusancy. An agent who had been convincingly playing a Catholic needed those objects to be convincing, but possessing them was itself criminal. This is a genuinely tense situation. and the men who navigated it were navigating it partly through clothing and partly through nerve. There are cases where Walsingham's people were caught not because their information was discovered, but because their material cover was insufficient, their clothing didn't quite match their story, or the devotional objects they were carrying were the wrong type for the community they claimed membership of. The Catholic communities in England knew each other. They had shared visual markers. Someone whose Catholic clothing was slightly wrong, the wrong type of Agnus Dei, a scapular associated with the wrong order devotional objects that came from the wrong workshops, could be identified as not quite right. The authentication of identity in this world was partly done through the authenticity of material objects, including clothing. Robert Poley and the art of the cover. Robert Poley was one of Walsingham's most effective agents, and one of the most morally troubling figures of the period. He worked his way into Mary Queen of Scots' network, posing as a committed Catholic, and fed information back to Walsingham for years. He was present at Christopher Marlowe's death in Diptford in 1593. What he was doing there, and what role he played in what happened, has been debated for 4 centuries. Poley operated through social infiltration. He was charming, convincing, and completely unscrupulous. He cultivated relationships with Catholic nobles and their servants, attended the right gatherings, demonstrated the right sympathies, and all the while reported everything he learned. We know from his expense accounts and from the records of his handlers that his cover involved significant investment in appropriate clothing and accessories. He moved in wealthy Catholic circles and needed to look the part. This was not a small expenditure. What's fascinating from our perspective is that Poley's cover was essentially a clothing-based performance. He wore the visual language of Catholic England, the dress, the accessories, the material markers of the faith, as a deliberate, calculated deception. He was writing in the clothing language fluently in a foreign dialect, and it worked for years, until he was burned eventually, not by a clothing failure, but by the collapse of the network he was embedded in. The Babington plot was betrayed on multiple fronts, and the participants, despite good operational security, were tracked down. Poley survived. Some of his colleagues didn't. The priest hole in the vestment box a slightly different angle, the hiding of clothing rather than the use of clothing as a hiding place. As the persecution of Catholics in Elizabethan England intensified, particularly after the papal bull Regnans in Excelsis of 1570, which excommunicated Elizabeth and effectively told Catholics that killing her was acceptable, making the government's response dramatically more aggressive, recusant households developed elaborate systems for concealing their faith. The priest holes, the hidden rooms and concealed cavities built into Catholic country houses to hide priests during government searches, are well known. Nicholas Owen, a Jesuit lay brother who spent his career building them, was eventually captured and tortured to death in 1606, still refusing to betray the locations of the holes he had built. He was canonized in 1970. Less famous are the vestment boxes. Celebrating Mass required vestments, the specific liturgical garments of a Catholic priest, the chasuble, the alb, the stole, the maniple. These garments were distinctive and utterly unmistakable. Finding them in a search was as incriminating as finding a priest, so recusant households hid them. In priest holes, yes, but also in concealed chests built into walls, under floorboards, in the false bottoms of ordinary furniture, in spaces built into chimney breasts. The vestments were the most dangerous clothing in England, and the hiding of them was as carefully engineered as the hiding of the priests who wore them. when houses were searched, and government search parties could be thorough, with authority to break open floors and walls if they suspected concealment. The discovery of vestments was often the thing that provided the evidence for prosecution. The priest could deny being a priest. The vestments proved it. Catholic households understood this. They became extraordinarily sophisticated in their concealment. The surviving priest holes at houses like Hindlip Hall in Worcestershire, 11 separate hiding places in a single house, are testaments to this sophistication. And the hiding of the vestments was as integral to the system as the hiding of the bodies wearing them. The Spanish ambassadors tailor, and now, one more angle, the use of the diplomatic community's clothing establishment as an intelligence front. The Spanish embassy in London, throughout the Elizabethan period a center of Catholic diplomatic intrigue and a contact point for English Catholic plotters, was associated with a specific network of artisans who served the diplomatic community: tailors, embroiderers, jewelers, glove makers. These people had legitimate access to the embassy. They came and went without attracting obvious suspicion. They handled objects, including clothing, that passed between the diplomatic community and their English clients. Walsingham knew this. His agents tracked these connections. The investigation that eventually unraveled the Ridolfi plot followed, among other threads, the movement of specific items between the Spanish embassy and the English Catholic network. What were those items? Some were money, some were letters, and some were goods, clothing, accessories that served as carriers or as gifts with embedded communications. The investigation files are incomplete and some of the detail has not survived, but enough has to make clear that Walsingham's people were tracking physical objects, including clothing and accessories, as intelligence. They knew that the clothing trade was a communication channel. They monitored it accordingly. The wedding chest and the trousseau when gifts between courts were acts of war. Let's change register for a moment. Not spies and executions. Marriages, specifically royal marriages, and the extraordinary complexity of the material culture that surrounded them. Royal marriages in the medieval and early modern period were, above all, political agreements. Two dynasties were linking their interests, their genes, their territorial claims. The marriage itself, the ceremony, the consummation, the public celebration, was the performance of that agreement. And surrounding the marriage was an elaborate exchange of material goods that was as much a part of the agreement as the vows, the trousseau, the dowry, the wedding gifts between courts. These were not incidental. They were the material language of the diplomatic relationship, and they were read with the same attention that ambassadors' dispatches received. What the trousseau said: a royal bride's trousseau, the collection of clothing, household goods, and personal possessions she brought to her new home, was a statement of her family's wealth and taste, but it was also a carrier of her family's visual language into a new court. When Katherine of Aragon came to England from Spain in 1501 to marry Prince Arthur, she was 15, Arthur was 15, and he would be dead within 5 months of the wedding, leaving Katherine in a legal limbo that would last years. She brought a Spanish trousseau. Spanish fashions, Spanish fabrics, Spanish embroideries. Her ladies wore Spanish dress. The English court was fascinated. Spain in 1501 was the most powerful kingdom in Europe. Isabella and Ferdinand had just completed the Reconquista and sent Columbus across the Atlantic. Spanish fashion was prestigious, exotic, and new in England. Catherine's Spanish clothing was admired. The farthingale, the Spanish hoop skirt structure that spread skirts into a wide, flat cone, entered English fashion partly through Catherine's example. This was not just a style influence. It was a visible, persistent reminder of the Spanish connection that the marriage was meant to create. The Spanish dress on the English court's Spanish queen was a daily advertisement for the alliance. When the alliance turned sour, when Henry's attempts to divorce Catherine escalated, the Spanish fashion became politically coded in a different way. Catherine's continued wearing of Spanish dress was a reminder of her origins, her family, her alternative source of power and legitimacy. It was a reminder that she was not just Henry's subject, she was a Spanish princess. Her clothes said so. The wedding gift as warning here is a specific case. 1527. Henry VIII is deep into his attempts to have his marriage to Catherine annulled by the Pope. The Pope at this moment is Clement VII, who is under the physical control of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, after the catastrophic sack of Rome in May of that year. Clement is essentially a prisoner. He cannot grant Henry what Henry wants without offending Charles, which he cannot risk. Henry's ambassador, Cardinal Wolsey, is in France trying to work around this impasse. Henry sends him detailed instructions. Among the things Wolsey is instructed to do is present the French king with a series of gifts, including textiles. The specific fabrics Henry sends as gifts are chosen with awareness of their diplomatic weight. He is not sending cast-offs. He is sending a message: I have resources. I am a serious player. You should be in my corner. Meanwhile, Charles V sends his own gifts to the relevant courts. The comparative quality, quantity, and appropriateness of the gifts is analyzed by recipient and their advisors with the care of contract lawyers reviewing terms. When a gift was inadequate, when a promised present didn't arrive, when the fabric sent was inferior to what the occasion warranted, this was noted and reported. The Venetian ambassador's dispatches from this period are full of observations about gift-giving, who sent what to whom, whether it was appropriate, what it suggested about the sender's intentions. A cloth of gold sent where cloth of silver was expected was a slight. An elaborate embroidered item sent where a simpler gift was traditional was possibly an overreach, possibly an attempt at influence. The wedding gifts between courts were documents in the clothing language, and the courts of Europe read them. The Valois tapestries and their hidden argument. Let's close this chapter with one of the most extraordinary examples of clothing encoded political messaging in the whole period. The Valois tapestries are a set of 8 large tapestries, now in the Uffizi in Florence, depicting court festivals and celebrations from the reign of the last Valois kings of France, Charles IX and Henry III, in the 1560s and 1570s. They are spectacular objects, technically accomplished, visually rich, full of figures in elaborate court dress, engaged in the tournaments, masks, and festivities that were the public face of the French court. They are also, almost certainly, coded political documents. The tapestries were almost certainly commissioned by Catherine de' Medici, mother of Charles IX and Henry III, the effective ruler of France through much of this period, for presentation to her daughter Margaret of Valois and Margaret's husband Henry of Navarre. Henry of Navarre was a Protestant prince who would eventually become Henry IV, the first Bourbon king of France, after the extinction of the Valois line. The festivals depicted in the tapestries are real events, mostly from the early 1570s, during the period when the French court was attempting to manage the relationship between the Catholic and Protestant factions after the religious wars. The depictions are not documentary, they're idealized, selective, politically arranged, and in their arrangements they tell a specific story. Scholars who have analyzed the tapestries have argued that the figures in them, identifiable by their costumes and their heraldic accessories, are arranged to tell a story about reconciliation, about the legitimate place of Protestant nobles at the French court, about the role of Catherine herself as mediator. The clothing in the tapestries, the specific heraldic colors and badges visible on the figures, was part of how this argument was made visible. Catherine de' Medici was sending a political argument to her Protestant son-in-law in textile form, a gift that was also a document, a set of pictures that was also a set of claims. The clothing in the pictures was evidence in the argument. The tapestries went to the Medici collections in Florence and survived. Catherine's France did not survive intact. The religious wars continued. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in August 1572 destroyed any possibility of reconciliation, and the Valois line died out with Henry III's assassination in 1589. But the tapestries with their careful clothing encoded political arguments still exist. You can see them in Florence. The argument is still there, in thread, 450 years later. The relic, the amulet, and the sacred body when clothing itself became the message. Here's a register shift. Not codes and ciphers, not colors and badges, something older and in a way stranger, the belief that clothing could carry holiness, or that holy things could be made to hide in clothing, or that the clothing of the holy dead retained the power of the person who had worn it. This is not metaphor. In the medieval world, relic theology, the veneration of the physical remains and associated objects of holy people, was entirely serious theology, backed by centuries of church doctrine, practiced universally, and capable of generating enormous political power. And clothing was central to it. Thomas Becket's hair shirt. Let's start with one of the most extraordinary clothing discoveries in medieval history. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, friend and then enemy of Henry II, murdered in his cathedral on December 29, 1170, by 4 knights acting on Henry's behalf, became, almost immediately after his death, the most venerated saint in England. His shrine at Canterbury became one of the great pilgrimage sites of Europe. His canonization was fast, his cult was enormous, and for the next 3.5 centuries he remained a central figure of English religious and political life. When Becket's body was prepared for burial after the murder, his vestments were removed, the magnificent archbishop's robes in which he had died, and beneath them, against his skin, his attendants found something they had not expected: a hair shirt. Worm-eaten, verminous, obviously long-worn, the kind of penitential garment that extreme ascetics wore against their skin to mortify the flesh. And not just a hair shirt beneath it, a further layer of a monk's habit. Becket had been secretly wearing a monk's habit under his archbishop's vestments for years. He had worn the most uncomfortable, least prestigious clothing possible against his body, hidden under the most splendid outer garments. He was presenting one face to the world, the magnificent prelate, the prince of the church, while hiding a secret identity beneath, the penitent, the monk, the ascetic. The discovery was greeted with amazement by his followers. It transformed him immediately from a martyred archbishop into something more, a saint who had hidden his true holiness behind a magnificent exterior, humble beneath the splendor, suffering in secret, genuine in his devotion despite, or because of the magnificence he was required to maintain. The hair shirt became a relic. It was preserved. It was venerated. It communicated to everyone who knew about it that Becket's exterior had been a disguise for his interior life. His clothing had concealed the real person. Henry II, doing his famous public penance at Becket's tomb in 1174, walking barefoot to Canterbury, submitting to a flogging from the monks, was, among other things, publicly acknowledging the power of what Becket's hidden clothing had communicated about his sanctity. The politics of sanctity. Becket's hair shirt is the most famous example, but it illustrates a principle that ran through medieval culture broadly. The holiest clothing was the clothing hidden from the world. This had political implications because holiness was political. A king who could claim personal association with a saint through relics, through patronage of a cult, through having dressed himself in association with sanctified material, had a source of legitimacy that no military power could quite match. The relic of a saint's clothing was as powerful as any other type of relic, and royal collections of relics, including clothing relics, were a standard feature of the major courts. The French Sainte-Chapelle, built by Louis Ix to house his extraordinary relic collection, contained clothing relics among many other things. The acquisition of significant relics was a diplomatic achievement equivalent to winning a battle. Popes distributed them as favors. They were carried into battle as talismans. And the clothing of kings who had been canonized or who had achieved particular sanctity was treated as a relic itself. The clothing of Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king, a genuinely pious man who was canonized in 1161, was preserved and venerated. His clothing was part of the argument for English royal sanctity. The Plantagenet kings were particularly attached to the Confessor's legacy. Henry III essentially rebuilt Westminster Abbey in the Confessor's honor. Richard II, our friend with the White Hart badges, specifically associated himself with the Confessor, commissioning a portrait, the Wilton Diptych, in which Edward the Confessor appears as one of the saints presenting him to the Virgin. He was reaching backward through the relic tradition to claim a sanctified lineage. What was he wearing in his imagination when he made this claim? The clothes of holiness. The clothes that signaled divine favor. The Confessor's patronage was a celestial wardrobe endorsement. The Agnus Dei in the body's secret. Let's return to the Agnus Dei, because it's the most widespread example of sacred clothing that doubled as coded religious identity. An Agnus Dei was a small disc of wax made from the paschal candles of the previous year, blessed by the Pope, and stamped with the image of the Lamb of God. They were distributed on the first year of a pope's reign and thereafter every 7 years, blessed in a specific ceremony involving a special water blessed with chrism, balsam, and other substances. They were credited with protecting against fire, flood, storms at sea, sudden death, and the power of the devil. They were worn on cords around the neck or sewn into garments against the skin. In Catholic Europe, owning an Agnus Dei was unremarkable. Everyone had them. They were distributed widely. They were given as gifts. They were valued devotional objects, completely normal. In Protestant England, after the Reformation, they were classified as superstitious objects, and their possession was eventually made illegal. A statute of 1571 specifically prohibited the import and use of Agnus Deis or other like vain and superstitious things from the bishop or see of Rome, which meant that the Agnus Dei became a hidden object. Catholics in England still owned them, valued them, treasured them, wore them. They hid them inside clothing, on cords under shirts where they would not be seen in a casual search, sewn into the linings of garments, in small pouches worn against the skin. When houses were searched and Agnus Dei were found, they were documented as evidence of recusancy. They appear repeatedly in the records of house searches, listed among the popish trinkets discovered. Sometimes they were on bodies. The suspect was wearing them when searched. Sometimes they were found in clothing, in pockets, in linings, discovered when garments were taken apart. The Agnus Dei hidden inside clothing was simultaneously a devotional object, evidence of a legally prohibited religious practice, a signal of Catholic identity to those who saw it, and a physical object that could be denied as innocent if necessary. It is a wax disc. It was my grandmother's. I don't know what it means. That defense worked sometimes, not always. Mary Queen of Scots and the relics she carried, Mary Queen of Scots, during her captivity, maintained her Catholicism not just in her embroidery and her public prayers, but in her physical body, the objects she wore against her skin. Her inventory of possessions made at various points during her captivity, these were made by her captors, monitoring everything she owned, includes devotional jewelry, rosaries, small reliquary items, Agnus Dei, and devotional medallions. Some of these were worn, some were kept in a casket, some were distributed to her servants. When she was executed, she reportedly wore an Agnus Dei around her neck, and her ladies attempted to retrieve it from her body after the execution. The executioner's assistants initially refused to allow this. The clothing and personal effects of executed persons technically belonged to the executioner. There was a scene. Eventually, some items were returned. The Agnus Dei she wore to her execution was the last thing on her body under her clothing against her skin. A wax disc the size of a coin, hidden under red martyrdom, the smallest possible physical object making the largest possible claim. I died for this faith. I wore it next to my heart. The afterlife of thread, what this language became and what it left behind, here's where we land. After all of that, after the embroidered mottos and the execution red and the badge wars and the hidden Agnus Dei and the hat brims full of treasonous letters, what happened to this language? Why did it fade? And what does it leave behind? Because it did fade, not immediately, not cleanly. But the specific, high-density political use of clothing as communication, the fluent reading of every color, badge, motto, and cut as a political statement, diminished across the 17th and 18th centuries and had largely disappeared in its most intense form by the 19th. Let's think about why. The printing press and the collapse of visual monopoly. The first reason is the printing press. This is not an original observation, but it bears specific attention in this context. In a world where most people couldn't read, visual communication had a monopoly. If you wanted to convey complex political information to a large audience, you had to use visual media, architecture, imagery, procession, clothing. The literate were a small elite who could read text, but the larger population got their political information through what they could see. The printing press, by making text cheap and increasingly widespread, and by driving up literacy rates across the subsequent centuries, gradually broke that monopoly. By the 17th century, pamphlets and broadsheets were reaching audiences that heraldry had previously dominated. By the 18th century, newspapers were doing political work that clothing had previously done. This didn't eliminate the political use of clothing. It competed with it. And as text became more powerful and more widely distributed, the unique advantage of clothing as a communication channel diminished. You could still wear a color to make a statement, but you could also print 1,000 pamphlets and reach more people faster with more precision. The embroidered motto that reached 20 people who could read it in the throne room gave way to the printed political argument that reached 20,000. The calculation shifted. The end of universal visual literacy. The second reason is the decline of the specific visual literacy that made the clothing language legible. heraldry, the systematic science of coats of arms, colors, and devices that underpinned much of the clothing communication we've been discussing, did not disappear, but it increasingly moved from being a universal court literacy to being a specialized antiquarian interest. By the 18th century, most educated people could not read a coat of arms in the immediate, intuitive way that a 15th century courtier could. The grammar was still there, but the fluent speakers were fewer. This was partly a consequence of social change. The court itself, the dense, highly organized, highly monitored environment where the clothing language operated at maximum density, changed character dramatically over the 17th and 18th centuries. The development of the nation-state and its bureaucratic apparatus, the growth of standing armies paid by the state rather than maintained by lords in their livery, the replacement of heraldic household badges with state uniforms, all of these changes reduced the environment in which the clothing language operated. Sumptuary laws, which had been the legal backbone of the color system, faded. England's last sumptuary legislation was in 1604, and it was not enforced. The idea that the government could control what you wore, and needed to, because what you wore was a statement of rank that needed to be reliable, gradually became implausible as the nature of society changed. When anyone could, in theory, afford to wear any color they wanted, color lost its exclusive associations. When anyone could display any badge without legal consequence, badges lost their exclusive meaning. The language didn't disappear, but it inflated. And inflated language is harder to use for precision communication. The survival, uniforms, vestments, regalia, what survived was the institutionalized version, clothing that retained specific, deliberately maintained meaning through institutional continuity rather than through the ad hoc political grammar of the medieval period. Military uniforms, which developed systematically from the 17th century onward, were the clearest descendant. The uniform solved exactly the problem that livery had solved on medieval battlefields. It made allegiance visually identifiable at a glance, in conditions where misidentification was fatal. The colors, the insignia, the specific cuts and distinctions of rank, all of this was the badge and livery system, regularized, nationalized, and maintained by state authority rather than by noble households. Church vestments retained their meaning intact because the church maintained the institutional context that made the meaning stable. The specific colors of the liturgical calendar, purple for Advent and Lent, white for Christmas and Easter, red for Pentecost and feasts of martyrs, green for ordinary time, still communicate to anyone who knows the code. The code is maintained. The Catholic priest putting on the chasuble is putting on communication, and the congregation reading the color knows the day's significance from the fabric. Royal regalia, the crown, the orb, the scepter, the robes worn at coronations, maintained a crystallized version of the medieval meaning. When Elizabeth II was crowned in 1953, the robes she wore, the specific fabrics, the order of dressing, all of this descended from a tradition that went back centuries, and all of it communicated in the surviving language of royal clothing, the nature of the office she was assuming. The specific ermine trim, the cloth of gold, the crimson velvet, the language was still there, preserved in amber, speaking through ritual. The Victorian recovery and the Romantic misreading. There was a moment in the 19th century when this history was discovered, rediscovered, actually, since it had never been entirely forgotten, just neglected, and romanticized in ways that shaped how we think about it now. The Victorian interest in medieval heraldry, in the visual culture of the Middle Ages, in what they called chivalry, this produced a wave of scholarship and a wave of romantic misrepresentation that are hard to untangle from each other. The Victorians understood that medieval clothing was encoded. They found this fascinating, but they tended to read it as primarily romantic and decorative, rather than as primarily political and practical. The Pre-Raphaelites painted women in medieval coded dress and treated the clothing as aesthetic. The heraldry enthusiasts traced coats of arms and treated the visual language as genealogical record. The collectors bought and preserved medieval clothing and treated it as historical artifact. None of them were wrong, but they were missing the live quality of the language, the fact that this was not a decorative tradition but a functional one, not a beautiful system but a dangerous one. The people who wore these colors and these badges were not playing dress-up. They were navigating a world where the wrong color at the wrong moment could get you imprisoned or killed. The Victorian recovery gave us the artifacts without the stakes. We ended up with the language without understanding that people had died speaking it. What we get wrong now, and this brings us to what we still get wrong, quite consistently, in how we talk about this history. We talk about medieval and early modern queens having an interest in fashion, as if fashion in the modern sense, personal aesthetic expression, participation in trend cycles, is what's happening when Katherine of Aragon embroidered her motto on her sleeves, or when Mary Queen of Scots chose red for her execution, or when Elizabeth I wore white virginity in her 60s. We remove the political content and leave only the aesthetic surface. This is a mistake. Not just an intellectual mistake, though it is that. It's a mistake that specifically distorts the history of women's political agency. Because here's the thing. The clothing language was one of the primary channels through which women in this period exercised political agency. In a world where women could not hold most formal offices, could not sit in most deliberative bodies, could not publish under their own names or speak in most public forums, the languages that were available to them, embroidery, dress, jewels, the careful management of visual appearance, were not peripheral to political life. They were political life. They were the tools available. When Mary Queen of Scots spent 18 years embroidering in prison, she was not consoling herself with a hobby. She was working. She was doing the only work that couldn't be entirely taken from her, in the only medium that couldn't be entirely censored, through the only channel that retained some possibility of reaching the people she needed to reach. When Katherine of Aragon wore her motto on her sleeves, she was not being sentimental. She was making an argument in the available medium, to the available audience, as forcefully as she could. When Anne Boleyn wore her bee necklace and her most happy motto, she was constructing a political identity and broadcasting it to every observer with eyes to see. These women were politicians. They were strategic actors in a dangerous world. Their tools happened to be needles and thread and color and jewels because those were the tools their world allowed them. To read those tools as decorative rather than political is to disappear the politics, to disappear the agency. To reduce these extraordinary people to their surfaces when their surfaces were, in fact, their arguments. What survives in the thread, there is something almost unbearable about the materiality of this story. The things survive when the people don't. Mary Queen of Scots embroidery exists. You can go see it. In Edinburgh, in the Victoria and Albert Museum, in private collections. The pieces she stitched in those long captive years, the emblematic panels, the fragments, the pieces that were cut up and redistributed and eventually found their way into collections, they're still there. You can look at them knowing that her hands made them, knowing what they meant, knowing what she was trying to say through thread when almost everything else had been taken from her. Katherine of Aragon's needlework. Fragments of Anne Boleyn's clothing, nothing substantial, but references in wardrobe accounts that confirm what she wore and when. The inventory of Mary's possessions made at Fotheringhay after her death, listing every garment in her wardrobe, every devotional object, every piece of jewelry. The clothing of these people was stripped from their bodies and catalogued and distributed and sold and lost and rediscovered and debated. The physical stuff of the story that we're telling, the very thread of it, literally, continues to exist in the world, preserved in museum cases and private collections and church treasuries and storage vaults. There is a kind of argument to be made. Historians of material culture have made it that the objects are the most reliable record. Texts can lie, documents can be forged, portraits can flatter, but the thread counts in a piece of embroidery tell you something true about the hands that made it. The dye analysis of surviving fabric tells you what color it actually was, not what later observers called it. The construction details of a concealed pocket tell you something real about the intention of the person who had it sewn. The clothing speaks. It spoke when it was worn to audiences who could read it. It speaks now to the scholars and conservators who measure and analyze and date it. The language is just more technical now. The message that never stops. Let me close with something that may seem small, but that I think matters. In 2016, archaeologists working on a restoration project at Norwich Cathedral discovered something inside a medieval wall cavity, a collection of shoes, hundreds of them, mostly children's shoes, mostly from the 14th and 15th centuries, deposited deliberately in the cavity, sealed inside the wall. Scholars debated what this meant. The best current interpretation is that the shoes were deposited as apotropaic objects, as charms against evil, hidden inside walls and floors and thresholds at significant liminal points. This was a widespread practice. People hid shoes inside buildings to protect them. The shoe, something that had been on the body, that had touched the skin, that had the shape of a human foot molded into it, retained something of the person who had worn it. Hidden inside a wall, it protected. This is a cousin of everything we've been discussing. The belief that clothing retains something of the person who wore it, some quality, some power, some identity. That the material object carries the human meaning even after the human is gone. And look, Mary Queen of Scots' red bodice, Katherine of Aragon's embroidered motto, the hair shirt found under Becket's vestments, the Agnus Dei worn against Mary's skin at her execution. All of these are the same thing. Clothing that carries a message beyond what any observer can fully see. Clothing as argument, clothing as identity, clothing as the last and most intimate thing that a person gets to say. The specific grammar of the medieval and early modern clothing language has largely been lost. Most people encountering a Plantagenet coat of arms won't read it fluently the way a 15th century courtier did. Most people looking at Mary's embroidery will see beautiful needlework rather than political statement. The audience has changed, the language has inflated and thinned, but the impulse hasn't disappeared. We still dress for occasions. We still read what people wear at specific moments with attention, at inaugurations, at funerals, at weddings, at state occasions. When Meghan Markle wore a specific shade of green to a specific event, or when Jacinda Ardern wore a hijab to meet with a grieving Muslim community, or when Michelle Obama wore a designer from a particular country to a state dinner with that country's leader, these choices were noted. They were read. They were analyzed and argued over. Not because people were being frivolous, because clothing still speaks. It speaks more quietly than it did. The stakes are lower. The audience is less rigorously trained. The specific semiotic system that made a shade of blue on a medieval battlefield a matter of life and death has been replaced by something more diffuse, more mixed with actual aesthetic preference, less likely to result in execution. But it still speaks. We still listen. We still read bodies and their surfaces for information about the people inside them, and about the relationships and allegiances and beliefs and intentions those people are carrying. We always have. We always will. Mary knew that on a February morning in 1587, walking into a cold great hall in a castle in the English Midlands, with her hair gray under her wig and her faith intact and her argument not yet finished. She dressed herself in the only language she had left. She wore red. And 500 years later, we still know what she meant. That's the story, or the outline of it, because I want to be honest with you. There's an entire book waiting inside every chapter of this script. The Valois tapestries alone have been the subject of serious academic argument for decades. Mary's embroidery has an entire scholarly literature. The Agnus Dei and the recusant clothing tradition, there are historians who have spent careers on that. If you want to go deeper, some starting points. Susan Vincent's The Anatomy of Fashion is the most accessible overview of early modern English clothing and its social meaning. Jane Ashelford's The Art of Dress covers the visual culture in beautiful detail. For the intelligence history, Stephen Alford's The Watchers is the definitive account of Walsingham's network, and it's genuinely gripping. For Mary Queen of Scots specifically, John Guy's biography is the one, thorough, sympathetic without being hagiographic, and very good on the material culture of her captivity. For the heraldry side, the badge wars, the livery, the whole visual language of medieval political affiliation, Nigel Saul's Richard II is excellent on Our White Hart King, and Anthony Tuck's work on the Plantagenet political culture gives you the broader context. Now, if you made it to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely. These long ones are the ones I most want to make, and they are the most work, and knowing that people actually sit down and listen to the whole thing makes it worth it. If there's a topic in this space, a specific person, a specific period, a specific court or conflict that you want us to dig into, leave it in the comments. That's where the next idea usually comes from. Subscribe if you haven't. The bell actually does help. The algorithm is mysterious, and the bell is one of the few things that reliably gets you notified. And if you want to go even deeper on any of this, I have some extended reading and sourcing notes below. Okay. I'll see you in the next one.